Welcome. If folks could grab a seat for the next session. So I'd like to welcome you to the presidential session, Career Threats and Opportunities. What is the role of social media in public scholarship? We have an esteemed panel for you today, and we want to welcome those of you that are watching around the world on live stream. So I will go ahead and let today's panelists introduce themselves. And while they're introducing themselves, you can tweet questions at us from in this room or from anywhere around the world at the hashtag AERA Pub Scholar. That's hashtag AERA Pub Scholar. And then we'll take some of those questions later in the conversation. So I'll go ahead and let the folks here each give a brief introduction.
Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank here in DC.
Nolan Cabrera, an assistant professor at the University of Arizona, study whiteness in education, and am engaged in the Tucson Unified School District's Mexican American Studies controversy.
I'm Sarah Goldrich-Rab. I'm a professor of educational policy studies and sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, soon moving to Temple University, where I'll be a professor of educational policy, higher educational policy, and sociology, and I study college affordability.
This is a very difficult room. First
Yes,
of all,
it is.
we should be in a much smaller room and you should all come closer together.
Yes.
But there's this tremendous echo, so I hope you can hear me because I can barely hear myself. I'm Diane Ravitch, and I'm a research scholar at New York University, and I spend about 18 hours a day blogging.
And I neglected to introduce myself. I'm Julian Vasquez Heilig. I'm a professor of educational leadership and policy studies at California State, Sacramento. I also direct the Doctorate in Educational Leadership, and I'm the elected chair of education for the California NAACP. So let's go ahead and get started with some of the questions. We're talking about opportunities and pitfalls today. So let's start with some of the opportunities. And one of the questions I've always wanted to ask Diane is, why did you start a blog? What opportunity did you see?
Well, I had written a book in 2010 called The Death and Life of the Great American School System, and there was a journalist from the New Yorker who was trailing around, and he said, I've been talking to people, and the critics say that you don't have solutions, so you better write another book. So I did write another book, but he also said, you need to blog. And so I started my blog like 2 days later. It was April the 26th, 2012. And I didn't know if anybody would read it, but it has since then had over 27 million page views. So what's happened is something incredible, which is I hear from people literally all over the country and frequently from people in other nations. I have correspondents in India, in Africa, in Australia, in New Zealand, and people have come to see the blog as a place where they can speak. I use the blog partly for my voice, but also to give other people a voice, especially teachers who feel that they're voiceless. And I have a lot of anonymous posters, and I check them out before I put their post up. But it's become a kind of a grand Times Square for people who don't like what's going on and don't have an opportunity to be heard. So it's been an amazing experience. I'm actually quite addicted. I'm no longer addicted to Twitter. I'm addicted to blogging.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And the questions are already coming in on Twitter, and I'll ask some of those in just a minute. Remember, AERA Pub Scholar. So I want to move to Rick Hess. You know, you're known for the Rick Hess straight up measurement, really could say, of public scholarship. We've communicated a little bit on email about some of the details of that in past years. I really would like to be ranked higher than 140. So what opportunities did you see in creating this metric? Where did it come from?
Diane, it's a little bit like being the parents of the Peanuts comic strip. It's I was, like most of my stuff comes from, I was on this visit with congressional yappers to some new technology-infused high schools in Indianapolis. I was bored out of my mind. It was all talking points, and it was in the middle of football season. And I was thinking it'd be nice is if we could have some of the conversations around what it meant to be an effective academic that wasn't just whether you were publishing in A-list journals, which I often find particularly tedious. And I was bored, and so I started noodling on paper about what some of these metrics might be, how to think about it. We did a rough cut, got some feedback that night from people who reacted to the blog, took another cut, and then year by year tried to think about ways to make sure that there were relevant third-party metrics, so it wasn't me kind of expressing my voice, trying to create a selection committee so that it wasn't me choosing who was going to be in the mix. And, you know, I think the idea was to try to create an opportunity for scholars to get recognized for work that was impacting the national conversation, separate from the quality of their disciplinary scholarship. And, you know, I think we've had some modest impact on that, which is generally all I ever hope for.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Let me turn to Nolan Cabrera, who is a professor in Arizona and junior faculty currently. So what type of opportunities do you think public scholarship, doing public work, offers you as an untenured scholar?
That's a very difficult question because I know a lot of my fellow non-tenured faculty members kind of shy away from the public scholarship because A, it's seen as a distraction from publish or perish, and at the same time you can get in a lot of trouble and you don't have the institutional protections of tenure. Thankfully, I have a department head, and his motto is that academic freedom is like a muscle. If you don't use it, it atrophies. And he actually encourages that to take the empirical work and try to get it into the public sphere. And so there's been an intentional push and an intentional valuing of engaging in the public scholarship, specifically from my department head along those lines. And then because of that public scholarship that I was engaged in, I was able to, this is really weird, I was actually able to be on the MTV documentary White People, which was really strange because I hadn't watched MTV since they actually showed music videos. And so I've had this weird relationship with being publicly engaged, but it was always part of being, there was never a distinction between being a publicly engaged scholar and a scholar. It was always trying to be one and the same. Now, doing MTV, I'm still having some reservations about it because, you know, we had a 2-hour interview, and actually, real quick shout out, thank you, Julian, for helping me through this. I was having a nervous breakdown, and he's sitting there going back and forth on Facebook Messenger, remember your talking points, calm down, don't talk too much. And I hit every single one of his advice points, except I did curse into a live mic one time. But beside that, it worked out really well. But the point was that it didn't really have the critical edge that I was hoping that it would. But again, it's MTV. And so I'm always having this question about what kind of an impact does this have? And it's really, really difficult to measure. It's difficult to assess. And I don't really know, but I also know that in the absence of that, someone else's voice is going to fill that space.
And we'll circle back to how do we measure impact? Should we use alt metrics? Let's circle back to that. So, Sarah, how has social media provided opportunities for you to engage with multiple publics?
Well, I think, so my work, as I said before, is about college affordability. And one of my great frustrations in that sphere is that while a lot of people are concerned about the price of higher education, they're not actually engaging in rich debates and discussions about the topic. They're upset about it, and they talk to each other and just say they don't like it, but they're not really talking about what we can do about it. And in the meantime, we've been doing the same thing over and over, to borrow a phrase from Rick, for the last 50 years with the same financial aid system and the same basic approach. And so I think it's super important that we catalyze discussion and debate wherever we can to try to get people to rethink their assumptions. And we're going to have to do that with a variety of constituents, because this system that we have right now engages a lot of people. It's not just the students. The financial aid officers who work in this, the policymakers who are thinking about how to create it, the college presidents. I mean, there's a lot of people with stake in this discussion. And social media allows us to have that reach to get to other kinds of people. So I talk to students on social media about financial aid and about the price of college, but I also regularly engage the student affairs practitioners and the financial aid professionals and the college presidents and the staffers on the Hill in that conversation, because, for example, Twitter allows me to have that reach, even though I've been sitting in a pretty small, frankly, pretty white, pretty liberal place for the last 11 years. And I think that's wonderful. I think it's been so great at helping me to improve the work that I'm so committed to, even when it has downsides.
I think that's an excellent point and really dovetails with the question that I'm going to take from Twitter right now. I want to remind those of you in the room and also those of you watching around the world, you can tweet questions at us live at AERA Pub Scholar. And so when I'm looking at my phone, I'm not testing my friends, I'm engaging at Twitter here. So the question from @RuthKravitz is, dovetailing with what Sarah just said, is how do we convince more scholars to work in collaborations with the communities in public ed? And a wise sage man told me on Facebook this week, academics are the first to call for change and are the last to do so.
Ouch.
What do you think? How do we engage better with communities? And I can answer that question too if you'd like me to.
I'm sorry, it's just that I thought you were addressing it to Sarah.
Yeah. No.
How do you do?
Oh, how do you
hear from here?
How do you engage communities better in public ed via public scholarship? I mean, with 20 million hits, 27. Well, you told me 20 million like maybe last week, so that's really, how are we better engaging with community groups? And I know we work together on the Network for Public Education,
right,
which is one of the primary goals, and we have many academics in that space. But how do we use our public scholarship to do that?
Well, I think that if you think of a non-digital world and a world where social media doesn't exist, the kinds of discussions we have are totally closed off to the public. So we can't reach people who don't have computers. We can't reach people who don't have cell phones, but more and more we can engage people because social media is so unbelievably democratic. And absent social media, decisions are made without communities knowing that they're targeted for destruction. I think about Paul Thomas at Furman University, who wrote a book called Beware the Road Builders. And he talked about how people in this little community somewhere, and I don't know whether it was Africa or some other place, they welcomed the road builders. The road builders come in with all kinds of promises of the improvements and the economic development, and then the road comes and it basically wipes out the village. I think now villagers have the opportunity to find out what the plans are and to try to stop them before they happen, because this is probably the most democratic political decision making has ever been, in the sense that we now have, you can tweet and you can exchange emails and blogs with people who are in decision-making positions, which you couldn't do before. So I think that if the question is how do you reach the people who don't have technology, I don't know. But you can reach people who do. If they're interested in the issue and if their community is at risk, they can search and you will connect.
I was going to say, I can give you a concrete example. I don't think that awareness out there, I don't think awareness is high enough on this issue, but I don't think most people would know that we now have fake tenure at the University of Wisconsin, if it wasn't for Twitter. I'm going to be honest. I think that the official words that have been put out there, the media coverage, et cetera, has totally not described the extent to which things have been destroyed. I think that voices have been elevated, voices of faculty that are not at Madison, but at places like River Falls and Superior and others, because Twitter is that democratic. I also think, therefore, it changed the tenor and tone of the debate. And now we're seeing leadership that is saying, we wish that people wouldn't think it was fake tenure, which tells us that we got somewhere.
Right. One of the things about my own scholarship, I blog at Cloaking Inequity, and I focus specifically on social justice and ed policy. And I started the blog because I wrote a peer-reviewed piece in the Berkeley Review of Education about attrition of Black students out of the KIPP charter chain. And KIPP had a whole huge marketing mechanism to respond to that piece. but yet I didn't have a way to communicate with the public around my scholarship and respond to that. And that was really sort of the genesis of my own blog. Now, I think one of the other things that about my blog that a lot of people don't know is oftentimes the posts that I write are written for specific people. They're written for specific legislators. They're written for specific community groups. And I don't say that explicitly. Like, for example, a legislator asked me to write a blog post about how charters make money, how people make money from charter schools. And so in the next week, you'll see a new blog post that I wrote for this specific legislator. And so my blog also allows me to communicate with the media, with specific policymakers and their staffers, and community organizations. I see folks from a Houston community organization who I've blogged for before and communicate with them on their Facebook page. But do universities and should the public value public scholarship? Is that something that in your cases you've seen your institutions or your organizations valuing the fact that you have this rating system, or valuing that you are on MTV, or valuing that you're a Twitter queen, or valuing that you have 27 million hits? Is that communicated to you?
Absolutely not. It's the complete opposite of it. That engaging in public scholarship, especially being a brown man in Arizona, is not exact. Let's just say it's not valued that much, and in many respects, the university is afraid of it. And when the Mexican American Studies controversy was hitting a peak, I had a meeting with the media relations people from the university, and put together this empirical piece, was getting ready for a news release, and the very first words out of their mouth were, "We're not really sure how this is going to portray the University of Arizona." And this is, to me, a non-tenured faculty member sitting there basically having the voice of the institution saying, not only do we not necessarily value what you're doing, but we're afraid of what it will look like to us. And thankfully, my dean, and I have to give him a lot of credit for this, he looked the guy right in the eye and said, "How it makes the university look is completely irrelevant. That's not, it's only about that this is sound empirical scholarship on a very important pressing issue. And we're trying to now engage the public scholarship and public debates, and that's what you're here for. So you need to do your job." But as a whole, as an institutional ethos, absolutely it's not. Because for all of the professions of institutions of higher education being these bastions of radical leftism and all this stuff, they're actually very conservative in nature. They care about their perceptions, their prestige, and whether or not people are going to donate. And the ideals of scholarship are slowly being eroded as a result of that, and it becomes in many ways sort of suppressing this public voice, and at the very least not valuing it by saying that it's separate from how you're going to be promoted.
Anybody else?
Completely agree. I 100% agree. I believe that the words that were used to try to dissuade me from continuing my work was that what I was doing was bad for the Badger brand.
So Rick, with your rating system,
I didn't know it was my job to work on behalf of a brand. I was working on behalf of students and families across the country.
I'm sorry for interrupting. So Rick, what has sort of been the response from your organization around the work that you do publicly? How have faculty thanked you for the rating system because their university considers it? For example, I see some places say, our college has 17 people, like I've seen Stanford report this, 17 people in Rick Hess's rating. What has been the response?
Yeah, I mean, AEI doesn't care. My job, your job at a think tank is to try to contribute to the national discourse in a way that is impactful. And there's all kinds of ways to what that means. Something like this is just, a little passion project. They don't care one way or the other. Yeah, I think in the academy, folks are using this when they're, in applications for the National Academy of Education. I know that there are deans that look at the list, especially in fields where they don't, that they're not familiar with, to try to identify interesting scholars that might not be cropping up through traditional disciplinary metrics.
Interesting.
So I think, there's also people in the field, obviously, who have raised, a variety of methodological critiques, all of which I would endorse, some kind of good-naturedly and others less so. But yeah, I think, I think there's a number of people out there who seem to find it useful in various ways to think about one part of what scholars can and should do that we've historically kind of undervalued.
So on the one hand, it sounds like in some places, it's actually trumpeted when faculty make this list. But then in talking with the scholars here, it seems like there's a message communicated that it's not as important. So, it's publish or perish. That's what I dealt with in my two promotions, right? So do you think that either now or in the future, we should see altmetrics, as Gustavo Fishman calls them, altmetrics in consideration of in tenure files? Do you think that'll happen anytime soon? Do you think there's going to have to be a generational changeover? What do you think about that?
I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Do you? I mean, the idea that social media would enter into our tenure files when writing a paper for the Brookings Institution doesn't enter in under research in our tenure files. A thoroughly researched, peer-reviewed, blind peer-reviewed paper doesn't. We're ways away from it. But, I just want to note, I love what Rick has done. I think metrics I have all kinds of concerns about unintended consequences and stuff. But what it's highlighted is to watch these institutions brag about their scholars being on that, while simultaneously not being willing to support the scholars doing the work, is quite a thing. And it helps to reveal something about the academy that then we can talk about. So I think that's actually, I don't know if that was your point, but you're really good at getting things going.
Any thoughts on that?
I'd say that, you could project ahead a few decades and say, will there be books? But if there are not books, or even in digital form, then there won't be scholarship, because you can write lots of blogs and you do lots of tweets, but that's not scholarship. Mm-hmm. So if you're being recognized for your scholarship, then you do have to produce a significant piece of work that has footnotes and where you can say there's evidence behind what I'm saying. The fun thing about blogging is sometimes you have evidence, sometimes you don't, sometimes it's just your opinion, but I don't think you can really get academic credit for that.
And one of the things that I've been talking about in some of the sessions I've been here is the scale of public scholarship. So for example, I remember at a session last year, they talked about how the average education peer-reviewed paper is read by 10 people. But, Diane Ravitch has 27 million hits, right? If I put something on my blog and it's popular, it may get 10,000 hits in a few days, right? And so the scale at which our work is available to the public, I remember Chris, he won the Early Career Award yesterday. He was talking about his TED Talk had millions of hits. So we can actually measure the impact of our scholarship in the millions, which I think is quite incredible. I want to ask another question that's come in from Twitter. That question is, what was your greatest success in social media, new media, and what was your greatest failure?
Somebody else go.
Greatest success obviously was being on MTV. The thing hit 2 million hits, but on YouTube, I know that's not, Adele, hello, 1.5 billion, but for a publicly engaged scholar, that's something. But my biggest failure, and it's a consistent failure that I've had, is I don't know how to deal with trolls. People come at me all the time and say, could you help explain something to me? Or I'm not quite sure, or you want to engage in a discussion, a dialogue. And usually what that means is I'm going to do everything to prove you wrong, and I'm going to say some really foul things to you. And then when you disengage, I'm going to call you names and do things like that. And so I've actually spent too much time engaging people in what I thought were going to be dialogues, and then actually finding out that they were just wanting a platform to yell at me.
Greatest success was not social media, but being on the John Daly Show.
I saw that.
Not John Daly, no, it's Jon Stewart. Jon Stewart on the Daily Show, because that was so exciting. And I did it twice. And the first time I did it, I was standing at the back of the stage, and they announced me, and I saw this. He announced me, and they are all clapping, and the woman behind me literally pushed me out because I didn't want to go out. And then he said my name, and they're clapping, and then he says, education historian, and it goes like. But he's a really, really great guy, and I was sorry to see him go off the air because he's incredibly smart. Anyway, that was a great success. I don't know, I've probably had a lot of failures, but everyone else is ready to point them out, so I'm the last person to do that.
Okay.
I'd say that when I don't like to engage in nasty debates on Twitter. That part I just totally avoid. But I'd say that anytime that someone attacks me, if I could make the mistake of responding, that would be a failure.
Right, which is something I learned from you. People have taken to writing blogs to critique the work that I do now over at Education Post and other places. And I asked you, well, you know, Diane, how do you respond to that? You've mentored me on public scholarship, and you said, you know, Julian, you shouldn't respond to them. And so I don't typically. I don't respond because you just stir the hornet's nest, right? On Twitter, occasionally I will, you know, respond, but I won't go into these long Twitter wars with folks. Yeah.
I'd say, if I can just say one more thing, the greatest success is people have encouraged to start blogging. And Gary Rubenstein, no, he was blogging before I met him, but there's several people who I've said, go on Twitter, get involved, speak up. You've got a lot to say, and I think that's a great success.
Rick, what would you say your greatest success, greatest failure, if you have some?
Yeah, I think it probably depends how you think about the role of social media.
Okay.
I think social media generally is a horrible format for trying to have thoughtful conversations.
Okay.
I think Twitter is beyond horrible. I think it's generally destructive. So my advice to folks is slightly different from, I think, what Diane shared with you, but in the same direction, which is I'm a big believer in sitting down with people who I fundamentally disagree with, because I like to learn from them. They rarely change my mind, I rarely change theirs, but what I'm interested in is trying to figure stuff out together. Like, how can somebody who's as smart as I think person X is just so fundamentally disagree? And why can they disagree? It's because of values, because of experiences, because of how we see the world. Diane and I have often had this relationship. But I think that kind of constructive disagreement, where you come out of it more human to one another with more trust, requires either that you do it face to face or some degree of intimacy and background. We had known each other 15 years before you changed your minds on these issues, so we had a lot of established trust to work from when we disagreed. And I think what happens is a lot of young scholars, or a lot of folks getting into this, their first interactions with one another are Twitter-based, right? So what happens is there is a lot of animosity and distrust and vitriol before people ever get to meet one another as human beings. The blog thing, my advice is slightly different, that if folks at blog X are critiquing me, and they're critiquing me, Tom Talk wrote one the other day for, I think it was 74, Campbell Brown's thing, slamming something I'd written, which is fine. If it's fair and it's not personal and it's just a disagreement grounded in how the world works, I think that's actually a really good opportunity to figure stuff out together.
Good point.
But generally not over Twitter, either by email or by extended responses back and forth, or by phone, or by getting lunch when we see one another. So for me, the successes have been when I've always generally shied away from Twitter conversation. I just use it to give people a heads up on what I've written. The successes are when that has led to new relationships or conversations with people who I might not have thought to talk to. Right. The failures are when people have reacted. Basically, that tends to reduce the number of failures. I don't have as many followers as some of my friends, I don't think. I'd have to look at that real careful, but I don't think I have the impact or the clout scores via Twitter, so that's a failure in that sense. But again, for me, that's not the goal of the medium.
Yeah, and I think actually you raised an interesting that I forgot to mention, which is when we're talking about altimetrics, there are metrics like the clout score, which Education Next uses to evaluate voices in education policy, right? And what the clout scores do is they look at your impact across traditional and social media and give you a number. Even Justin Bieber, is that how you say his name? Bieber? Okay, I'm obviously getting old.
Well, so is he. So
right.
So I want to disagree a little bit with Rick.
Okay.
Not surprising. As I said at the beginning, you know, if the goal is to get people to talk about something, have a discussion about something that you care about, I think that that can be done on Twitter. I'm one of the few that thinks you can have a substantive discussion. And I don't think you necessarily need to actually know each other very well. And to give you an example of that, if you go online and you Google my name and Storify and Mark Cuban, you will find a substantive policy debate that Mark and I had that he initiated a couple of Saturday nights ago. You know, I'll admit, on a Saturday night, I was sitting at home watching, I don't know whether it was the GOP or Democratic debate, I don't remember, but what I remember was that, lo and behold, at like 9:15 at night, Mark Cuban started tweeting me about student loans. Now, yeah, we've met before, once, for a very abbreviated amount of time, so we've hardly, you know, gotten to know each other, and we had a back and forth, which he disagreed on, which I respectfully, you know, went back at him on. There was one moment where, you know, I think he kind of said that I was being dismissive towards him, and I understood why he might have thought that. That wasn't what I was saying, and I corrected it. But you can look at the exchange. First of all, it was useful and important because there are not very many people as prominent as Mark Cuban talking about this issue. Second of all, that means we got a whole bunch of people interested in this policy discussion that wouldn't have been. They know him because, you know, of his other activities. And so I thought it was well worth doing. My mistakes and my regrets have to do, frankly, when I've deviated from my mission. When I've decided to comment on things that are really off topic for why I'm there. And it's blown back, and I do actually regret the extent to which I haven't called out the nonsensical ways in which things have been utilized. I mean, you know, if you look at what happened to me in the last year, if you know about that and you don't acknowledge that my Twitter was used in order to kickstart a presidential campaign, you know, that it wasn't actually that I'd done something wrong, but it was leveraged by my governor, then you missed the real story. At the same time, it isn't my goal in life to be talking about the, you know, mechanics of how certain folks are starting their presidential campaigns. I want to talk about affordability, but it's tempting to go off topic. So I recommend sticking close to the topic that one is trying to advance, probably safer ground.
You can also have less substantive debates on Twitter. If you type in Julian, Vasquez, Heilig, and Michelle Rhee, you could see our discussions about charter schools, which was much less substantive.
Yes, you absolutely can. I just want to point out it's still possible to have one, and I don't think the 140 characters is necessarily the issue there. Right. I think there's a question of intent, right? And having the goodwill between the two folks and the respect is an important part of it.
So I would want to add, Julian, that one of the things I find extremely useful about Twitter is that frequently I have gotten tweets from scholars who sent me a link to something they had written that would never ever get out, except for the 2,000 people reading that journal. And I'd read it and say, this is terrific. And then I would retweet it and I would do a blog about it. And it's a wonderful way to expand your readership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, of course.
And learn.
So I'd like to take a question from Christine Greenhow that says, has using social new media helped your research be taken up by various stakeholders and the medias?
I'm sorry, it is hard to hear. Taken up by scholars, people in the media? Or
taken up by various stakeholders, media. So one of the things that I talked about in some of my sessions today, for example, is because I do a lot of public scholarship, I also get a lot of opportunities to do traditional scholarship. And so some people think that if you do public intellectualism, that'll somehow temper the opportunities that you have. Do you think that you get more opportunities because you're doing public work?
I absolutely think so, and I also think that that translates for opportunities to do books. I mean, I'm definitely, I think, contacted more frequently than I used to be about opportunities to write. I think that I actually just got a question from a potential funder who wanted to not only, the usual question is like, will you disseminate your work and how? I got a question about the specific mechanisms that I would use in social media for dissemination. Like, will we get to see you tweet about it, or will you only, you know, put it on LinkedIn or something? I mean, I was amazed at the intricate level of that. I think it's absolutely the case, and you never know who's reading. So by talking about something, I mean, I found that so many congressional staffers are clearly monitoring Twitter. And then we'll call and ask, and I'll get an opportunity because I mentioned it in a much more democratic space.
Well, there are two things I would want to add. One thing that has concerned me about social media is that when people post comments anonymously, they say really vicious things. And, you know, there's no defense against that, except that when it's on my blog, I can delete them. But lots of times I've looked at other people's blogs and you see, you know, these kind of vicious personal attacks by someone with a made-up name. But I think that I'm concerned about the future of scholarship, given the move to this kind of internet world that we live in.
So another question I have here, thinking about the future here, is a question about Stephen Salita. Should institutions be able to censor your public scholarship? Should they be able to essentially unhire you?
No.
That's the end of
you got to give me a little more here.
There's no academic freedom if they can do that.
It's the new litmus test, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, when I went thinking about going somewhere else, it was one of the first things I did was take a look at those institutions and their behavior around social media. I mean, I think, you know, if you're serious about this work, you have to find places that are conducive to your work, just like we do when we look at institutions and say, can you support doing research, right? Do you have a well-functioning grants office? How does your IRB work?
Yeah.
You know, do you have a social media policy? Do you understand what's going to happen here? You know, I mean, I actually really went in there and really quizzed people to make sure that, you know, it was at least a relatively safe space.
Is there a political cost on your colleagues? And let me explain what I mean. You know, when I was at the University of Texas, I wrote a blog piece about a particular elementary school in Austin, Texas. And the superintendent at that time was very angry that I wrote this blog post. It had maybe 20,000 hits in just a week or two. Then when I arrived in Sacramento, I wrote a piece about Teach for America and special education in a local district. And the superintendent called my dean. And the dean wanted to have a conversation with me. I've never said this in public before. Now I'm saying it to millions of people. So I went down to talk with the dean. I don't think I've even had this conversation with you, Diane. And the dean essentially said to me, I don't really think your blog is academic scholarship. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think it's academic scholarship usually, unless you're using the blog to draw people to a study you've done, which you have done frequently. But I don't think your blog should be subject to censorship by your dean or by the local superintendent.
That's right. It doesn't have to be scholarship to be protected. I mean, in some ways, this conversation, you know, it makes me wonder whether we should stop talking about it as scholarship, which is putting it under the column of our research, and start thinking about it as teaching. I mean, I really think in many ways, well, I haven't been in the classroom as much as I might have liked to over the last decade because I'm doing heavily funded research, that I am getting to do some real teaching on Twitter. You know, and not just on Twitter, but because of Twitter, it's opened up people who have come to me and sought other, you know, will I take a look at a paper, things like that. You know, in some ways, that's part of what this is. And I feel like the university is there to uphold your academic freedom in terms of how you do your service, how you do your teaching, and how you do your so-called research and scholarship.
Okay, so just go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, on sort of the flip side of that, though, I definitely agree with what you just said about the, there is this tension that it's what's scholarship and what's public voice, and in these two things. And I remember Mary Beth Gassman having a really interesting post on diverse issues in higher ed a couple years back, where she was relaying some conversations that she'd had with a number of her graduate students. And those grad students were having these issues about, you know, how do I engage in the public scholarship? How do I get my stuff out on, Twitter wasn't as big back then, but out on different forms of social media. How can I get speaking engagements? How can I get, you know, involved in the media and all these different things? And she said, you're putting the cart before the horse. You have to do the good work first, and then you have to do the scholarship first, then you can look at how to disseminate it out and basically be first and foremost a person of substance before you become that public intellectual. Because in the absence of that, it basically is policy relevant as Kim Kardashian. It's out there, it's on Twitter, but it doesn't really have the substance. And I think that that's a core component that we need to remember, that we're pushing really hard, but we can't lose the core of what we're doing at the same time.
That's a great question that dovetails into this question from Twitter, from Mark. Public scholarship reaches a large audience, but blog posts are not refereed for quality and ethics in the same way. So the question that I had prepared that also goes with that, have you been accused of your scholarship lacking rigor because it's publicly engaged?
I never have been. I have to say, that's one thing that's really boggled me, is that you would think for the critique that I've taken, especially from the university, that there was a problem with my work. But they've never suggested there was a problem with my work. Not about the content of my blogs, not about any of that stuff. And I very much agree with what was just said. I do think, I mean, there's folks out there that are weighing in on all kinds of stuff that I know they haven't studied. And I mean, you've been around for 5 minutes, like give it a little time. Yeah. And I don't think that the bar, by the way, is do you have tenure or not? I think it's have you done the work, right? Yes. Which some folks can do a ton of work in a couple of years. But for the most part, it takes a little while. But I really think if you really look at some of the folks that really have taken a tack, and there's a lot of us women especially that have, right? These folks do good work, and nobody's really talking about the quality of the work. They're just saying they don't like how we said it, which they really mean where we said it, how we look when we said it, how our hair was cut when we said it. I mean, really, you have to get underneath some of these critiques.
Well, that fits right into this next question from Dr. Anna Sullivan. It says, how do you handle abuse on Twitter? Example being trolls. Now, I'm just going to tell a story. I often get trolled on Twitter. And so there's this 6-hour loop of a man singing in another language. He said, blah, 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 like that, just on a loop for about 6 hours. So when people troll me, what I will typically do is respond with that YouTube link. How do you deal with Twitter trolls? What do you do?
I basically ignore them. I mean, I used to engage, and then I found that if someone is a troll, they're there to get under your skin. And the worst thing you can do to them is to ignore them. That really upsets them. But I have trolls on my blog, and unless they become abusive, I let them say whatever they want to say, because I'm very critical of, let's say, Eva Moskowitz and the Success Academy Charter School. I have someone who's on my blog 10 times a day telling me how wonderful her school is, and I engage with him, others engage with him. One of my other followers calls him Mr. Non Sequitur, because he likes to change the conversation to, look how terrible the public schools are, that's why we need Eva Moskowitz's school. But I think it makes the blog more lively to have people who disagree. So I don't take anyone off unless they attack me personally. I have a list of things you can't do. It's my living room. You cannot attack me personally. I won't stand for that. You also can't use 4-letter words unless they're words that I use.
I would say something fairly similar. There is a difference between disagreeing and being abusive. There's a gentleman out there as an alumni of my university who has been trolling me for 7 years. I think that's sad. I think that's pathetic. And I have him blocked. I didn't used to block. Now I've decided, having taken death threats, that I am done. I am going to block you. That's why there's a block feature. If you go too far, I will report you. I have called the FBI on a recent thing that happened because people are going too far. And I think it's the constant stuff. It's also the really weird behavior of them going after other people who talk to you, right? Finding your students, finding other people who support you, and then they go to them. There's got to be a word for it beyond troll, I actually think, because, there's really something going on with folks out there who find this to be a good time. But it is the cost of doing this work. And it's certainly, I'm not complaining about it. I'm explaining what I would do with it. Because, I'm certainly willing to bear it. Otherwise, I would have gotten off of Twitter and stopped blogging.
Well, the good thing with blogging is there are stages. You can say, I'm putting on moderate. So moderate means I get to read before you get posted.
That's right.
Block means you will never appear on this blog again. Yeah, I've blocked a number of people for abusive behavior.
So there's a tweet here that says that Nolan is very handsome. He's rocking the panel. We'd like to hear his voice more. So I just wanted to let you know that, brother. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Speak up.
What would an ideal, this is from Rob, what would an ideal progressive, forward-thinking social media policy look like for an institution?
I would be worried about an institution having a social media voice. That would suggest that the institution has a voice, whereas there are many voices there. And when you try to meld them all together, some of them are going to be silenced.
So Eric Rollman's written, though, about how universities should protect public scholars, and I like that stuff. If you look up his work, I think he's done a really good job of pushing us to, you know, I mean, you're an assistant professor. Like, there are things they ought to be doing to protect you, including reminding you that they're proud of you for your work, and it's great you get on MTV. Good job. If I were your colleague, I'd be going around going, good job, you know? It's important.
And that's the beautiful part about it, is that my immediate colleagues are very protective. And that's that protection I am incredibly thankful for. It's more that the higher up that you go in the institution, the more and more scared that they become. And also because the farther that proximity, the less control they have over me directly. And so, yeah, I know the Office of General Counsel very well, and they don't like me very much. So,
can I say one thing about that? Because there's a piece of advice I've been just dying to get out there more broadly. The Office of the General Counsel, that's good, but they're not there for you. They are there for the institution. And let me tell you that you need to find a lawyer and just get to know them for when you need them in academia. I just want to say that. Find a good lawyer and know who they are, because you never know when you're going to need them. And please do not hesitate, just write the check. Just pay them. They are professionals and they will help you. But please do not listen to your university tell you that the Office of the General Counsel is here to help. They're not.
and also remember, they will tell you that you have to be represented by them when you don't.
Right.
That's the trick. This is a university affair. You're a university employee. We need to be your legal representation. No, I'm still a private citizen, and I can be represented by whoever the hell I want, or heck I want. Sorry, I get really mad about this because they've been playing games with me, and I'm not happy. So then I put them on blast, live stream to the world.
Okay. So let me ask this question. Do folks talk to you about citing your public scholarship in work? Do you cite public scholarship in your work? I know that I sometimes cite my blog in peer-reviewed pieces, right? Do you find yourself being a part of the curriculum? Sometimes people say, this blog is required reading for a particular class. Do you hear that?
Yeah. I know that a number of people have told me that they read the blog as part of their classwork, but I don't ever cite it. I mean, in my books, I don't cite myself except for other published work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does get, it does get used that way, at least in some places. Yeah, I don't think I cite blogs per se. More what I do is, for me, the process of writing is always about trying to work out my own thinking on issues.
Right.
And blogging, everybody up here, I think, blogs pretty regularly. I think I've figured that I blog, 50,000 words a year, give or take. Wow. And so, in a lot of ways, that becomes rough drafts of portions of my longer form work.
Right.
Whether it's, I haven't written a refereed piece, I think, in probably half a dozen years because I got sick to death of the whole process. But for longer form, for Fight Out the Captain or Educational Leadership or various magazines or for books. And so for me, there's absolutely an ongoing interaction. One of the nice things about the blogging is as people respond, kind of Diane's alluded to this, people come out of the woodwork, you learn things you didn't already know, people share, and I think you alluded to this too, Julian, people share information, facts, insight that you otherwise might have not been able to tap into. And so I think, you absolutely can use all of this as part and parcel of that thought process.
And I will, okay, I will cite blogs in my scholarly work, but it has to be in a very, very, very specific way. So I am very sensitive to the idea that the blogs don't go through this rigorous review process, and so it's very difficult to consider it scholarship on the level that it would be maybe in a literature review or something like that. But I find blogs very helpful in terms of setting the stage, in terms of setting the debate, in terms of setting up what people are talking about. And so in that sense, I cite blogs all the time, especially in like the introduction, but I sort of have to say beyond that, no, because otherwise it starts to create a shakier foundation for the peer-reviewed scholarship that I'm working on.
So if you take the time to read the footnotes in my book that's coming out soon, I cite tweets, which I didn't think I would do, except that there were some really good discussions that were happening about the topic. And I had to think about how to do it, and I think it was a little torturous to figure out how exactly you cite these things. But I think some people will be surprised that there are tweets in the book.
So I want to ask a question again from Twitter. I lost it here. I'm sorry, I can't say who it was from. About balancing your public and your private. Now, one thing that probably a lot of folks don't know about me is I have private channels on Facebook. Not everything goes out to everybody on Facebook. But one of the things that I do try to do in my blog is talk about really personal stories from my life. So for example, my last blog post on cloaking inequity, I was talking about how I was that fourth grader, for you educators out there, that had excess energy, lots of excess energy, and it found me into a lot of little trouble, right? And talking about how my teachers sought to refine that energy over time and help me focus it in the right places. And you know, I talked recently about how I was buying a car. So I was in the airport last week, and someone I didn't know came and talked to me and said, "What car did you buy?" Right? And when I see people around AERA, they come up and they talk to me like we have a very personal relationship with each other, even though this is the first time we've met, because sometimes I share those sort of really private inner feelings. So how do you separate that public, private in your public scholarship?
I think that blogging has made me a better writer because in some strange sense, I feel like I know who I'm writing for and I know who they are, even if I haven't met them. And so I'm able to be more personal than I would be if I were writing a book. But then if I turn to do something for a publication, it's not exactly the same tone, but it's a far looser tone than if I were writing a scholarly work. So I do book reviews like for the New York Review of Books, and I found that some of the blog voice transfers over into that kind of writing where it becomes easier to read, more accessible. I mean, to me, this is a problem with scholarship, is so often it's boring.
So I think this is a good distinction for folks to think about, which is kind of the tonally versus being personal substantively. You know, I mean, one of the things I like about blogging is, you know, the ability to just talk to people like you would talk to people, rather than all of the finery of academic forums. Personally, I don't, you know, partly because, you know, much of, you know, the way that I tend to approach these issues, my priors tend to be orthogonal or opposed to kind of the center of gravity of AERA, most schools of education. So I learned, you know, I was getting boycotted and booed, you know, at AERA and ed schools 15 years ago, when you guys were still younger. So I've felt little or no interest in sharing personal. So I'm not on Facebook. On Twitter, I don't write about anything that's not, you know, kind of policy and read that. I don't get into personal conversations. I don't ever share pictures of my family or use those in terms of like Twitter. So for me, it's just very much that this is a way to kind of engage with people professionally in the conversation. And the way I deal with this is my private life is for my family and my friends.
I do the complete opposite. And to be honest, I'm doing it for a reason. There are a lot, especially of women out there, who've been afraid to enter a lot of these conversations, and, you know, issues like how do you juggle having small children? You know, they might be interested in my work in affordability, but I blogged a lot about what it was to have 2 babies on the tenure track after I'd been explicitly warned that that was a bad idea. you know, and I think one of my most read blog posts was about what happened when I was traveling between gigs and I spilled some breast milk at the airport, and how I cried my eyes out and didn't know what I was going to do next. And I think it was teaching, but I also think it's just humanizing. And I think, you know, for those of us that go in there and try to get somebody to hear our ideas, part of the way you do that, even with policymakers, is to talk with them about things that really matter.
Yeah.
So my grandfather is both part of some of the best of my public work and some of my worst moments of my public work. But he's incredibly important to me. He helps drive why I do what I do. You know, the fact that he went to college on the GI Bill and what he's taught me about the possibilities of this country doing better in its public policy. And, you know, there are some things that y'all don't know about me that I even am keeping private at this moment. But for the most part, I'm much more of an open book. And I think it surprises people and it disarms people. But, you know, the other thing is it's not realistic. I mean, I recently expressed some concern about something in my private life that was getting out there. And somebody said to me, you are a public scholar and you get everything that comes with it. Just accept it, get over it, and figure it out. And I actually thought that was pretty true.
Actually, I never write about my children or grandchildren because I've been warned by them not to.
I didn't ask.
That's awesome.
Your babies have no choice in the matter.
So, you know, this week I was celebrating a couple of really cool things. The first was that I was asked to speak from the Lincoln Memorial Steps at the SOS March in July, so please join us for that march. The second was that I was named to a list of multicultural champions, which included Michelle Rhee and Jeffrey Canada, and really, you know, Sonia Nieto and Pedro Noguera, which I don't think I belong on that list. But I was really excited about that. And what I did was I sent that to my president. And I said, I'm really excited. I feel honored. I feel like I'm representing the university well. And he wrote me back and he said, you know, you're making a difference. Thank you for what you're doing. And that made me feel so reaffirmed. And so thank you, President Nelson, for that email. Do you get that kind of response from the presidents or the directors of your organization, from the deans? Like, do they recognize and appreciate the extra work that you do above and beyond the traditional scholarship?
On top of my president being president of our university and pulling in about $750,000 a year, she just decided to become part of the board of DeVry and pull in $170,000 on top of it. So she didn't have time to meet with students, doesn't have time to meet with anybody. She doesn't care. And when she's gone, the U of A will start to look a lot better.
I find my new dean, Greg Anderson, and my new president, Neil Theobald, to be very supportive of my public engagement at Temple University. Let's leave it at that.
How about you, Diane?
We have a new dean, and I'm in an odd position. I'm not tenured, I never have been, and I'm always on a year-to-year basis. So I went in to see about renewing for a year, and I earned the least possible salary that you can earn and still be on the faculty. And so I said, I'd like to stay on the faculty. I treasure the relationship. And I said, and look at my standing on Rick Hess's EduScholar list. And he kept me on for this year. I don't know about next year. I'll have to see how I do on Rick's list.
Next year. Okay. So I want to know if there are questions that you want to ask each other. We only have about 15 minutes left. Are there any questions that you think I need to ask that I haven't asked?
Well, I would like to ask Sarah about what happened with her governor and what did he do to her because of her Twitter feed.
My governor, okay, the words I want to say are my governor is smart. I'm not sure that's completely true, but he's savvy. And so he would never do something direct. I believe, and I have evidence to back me up, that he worked indirectly to take a shot at me. And he did so through the channels of the administration of the university. I know that the public statement that was made, if you all saw that I was censured because of tweets, was on university letterhead as if it were official, and yet that would have been illegal for them to do, and it was done without an open an open meetings notice. And I know that the 3 people who took that action, who did not represent the committee, were asked to do that.
What did you tweet that he found offensive?
I tweeted that my grandfather, found striking similarities between him and a certain genocidal dictator person whose name I will never mention again, not because he was going to put anybody in a concentration camp, but because he exhibits neo-fascist tendencies, which I still believe.
You could have compared him to a former senator of Wisconsin.
Well, this is I could have, but here's the thing you need to know. I mean, this was said, we went there, didn't we? We went, so this was said June 1st, and 6 weeks went by before anything happened, and nobody said anything, and nobody was upset about it. This was used by Governor Scott Walker's son, who is at the head of the college Republicans on our campus, to help kickstart an issue that the governor was interested in, which was getting rid of tenure. And I'm sorry really sorry that I provided anything they could use in that, right? But what boggles me is that folks failed to utilize their incredible research abilities to actually study what happened and analyze it and understand the political and economic context of what was done before they too acted to say shame on her. And that, from scholars, I must say, was more disheartening than anything else that went on. And so I really think that while we're not going to get people like him to behave responsibly towards us, we have to therefore in the academy be responsible to each other. And if we can do that, I could have been insulated from that sort of thing. Somebody could have said, what nonsense. She's a scholar, she does her work, she's stood by us, she's contributed, she's raised millions, she's taught students. What nonsense to be talking about a little tweet that was literally, I love the word for it because it's so small and tiny.
Right. You know, and I recently, Michelle Malkin from Fox News wrote a piece about Teach for America. And it was late at night, and I just quickly shot off a tweet that said, you know, if the right starts to critique Teach for America in the way that Michelle Malkin did, there's going to be a lot of trouble. And it set off this Twitter storm of about 1,000 tweets, one single tweet. And so one of the things that I tell graduate students and junior faculty, you have to be really thoughtful about what you tweet because it's evidence. They can take screen captures. It's forever. One day you might want to be a university president or a dean or run for office. And so try to be really thoughtful about what you put out there on social media, because something that, you know, could quickly, you know, seem very innocent can become a really, really big deal. So I got another question from Twitter, which was, do you use your blogs to make your research more accessible? And this is from Amber Black. Or do you do it to engage and discuss other work?
Well, most of what I post is aggregated. And someone once threw that at me as an insult and said, you're just an aggregator. But I like to showcase other people's work. I've many times posted things of Rick's, of yours, Julian's, and Anthony Cody. I have a whole, there's a whole stable of wonderful bloggers. And they don't have as large a reach as I do, so I'm happy to give them a place to show off their work. And then when I write a piece of my own, I'll often co-post it. Like today, I had a piece this morning that was posted at 11 o'clock on my blog and at 10 o'clock on Huffington Post. So it gets more circulation. But yeah, I like giving people the voice, and people appreciate that. They also appreciate, I think teachers especially appreciate that they have a place where they can read other teachers and not be lectured at by somebody who has not been teaching kids in K-12, as I never have. So I know my limitations, and I'm very happy to give teachers the platform.
I think one of the perils that folks have been asking me about here at the conference is balance, life balance, right? I've been saying that public scholarship is an and proposition for those of us in the academy because we have to publish in peer-reviewed journals. So this is an and, not an or at this time in the world. And so how do you promote balance in your life? How do you blog 50,000 words a year? I mean, I have blogged probably about 600 blogs over the last 3 years, and now I've started a podcast about Teach for America. I do a lot of these other things, and the question that I always get is, Julian, how do you find balance? Do you spend time doing other things? Yes, I watch Walking Dead at 9 o'clock on Sundays. I do. So how do you find that balance?
I don't have balance in my life.
I was going to say the same thing.
Well, let me say this.
No, my children are grown,
balance.
and I'm a grandmother, and at
Yep.
the moment my kids, 2 of them are in college, 2 of them are living in LA for this year.
Yep.
So I don't have any balance.
When I first met Diane, can I tell you this story? She invited us to her house in Brooklyn. We were starting this new nonprofit called the Network for Public Education. First time I had been to her home. And so we were there, and we were having a meeting, and Diane was blogging while we were having the meeting. And then I understood what it took to be Diane, to be able to multitask all throughout the time we were with her. It was incredible. It was incredible. How do you all have balance?
My kid, yeah, because when I'm with him, there's nothing else. There's not, the phone is put away. We every Monday we have breakfast together, take him out. We have our own little booth. We order the same thing, but it's time where it's just us, period, nothing else. And having these times to do that, to cook, do Brazilian jiu-jitsu, do all these different things, and when it's doing that, there's nothing else. You know, I can't work out in the gym because my mind starts going to things like, what's my next blog post going to be? What's this article? There's this R&R. I'm going to go to this meeting. No, I can't do it. I need things that are complete distractions from any of the other work, and just carving out that time. And that time is sacrosanct. So my students know, do not contact me when I'm doing this stuff. Unless, like, the world better be crumbling down around you. And it's happened a couple of times this year, but usually it's like, do not bother me at all during this time. And then when it's time to be on academically, or it's time to be on in blogging or things like that, then it's that, and I'm happy to do it. 100% focus here or 100% focus here. I can't multitask, because that means that I end up doing everything badly, and that's just my style on that.
What about you, Rick?
I really like that point about the multitasking in particular. I think one, having priorities. Same thing. My son is vastly more important to me than weighing in on this or that dispute. It'll get sorted itself out. We're a country of 340 million people. If I weigh in or not, nobody actually gives a crap. But I think one is having that and having some sense of humility and understanding that the role each of us plays is, one little thread in a larger tapestry, and that the place where I actually really do matter is with my family and my friends and my intimates. So that's part of it. The second, though, is I think especially if you want to be a public-facing scholar, what we have far too much of, especially in the media environment and the cultural environment, is talking and reacting. It's very easy to talk and react in 2016. And I think what there's a dearth of is thought and reflection. And if there's anybody, this is something I write about when I do the EduScholar every year, if there's anybody whose job description gives them the freedom and the luxury to actually read and reflect and listen to people who disagree. It is not advocates and policymakers, people and philanthropists who are pushing money out the door with to-do agendas. It's people who are scholars, who have a chance to read, who have a broad base of knowledge to actually make sense of this stuff. And so I think when we engage in the public square, I think our maximum value is when we're not being reactive. And so I actually try to make it a point to carve out lots of time to read and cogitate and think and understand that, the time I spend actually writing or sharing is kind of the value of it's inversely proportional to how much time I've spent doing that other stuff first.
So on that note, I'm reading a book about this because I thought it was recommended to me. I believe it's called NetSmart. And it was by somebody who's given this, world a lot of thought, the social media world and all of this. And he talks a lot about how to focus your attention. I'm very interested in what Nolan just said, because I have this issue too in the gym. So I don't want to go there. So I like this idea of taking up something that, you have no choice. You got to pay attention. But I do reject the idea that you know, that there's work and then there's life, especially for those of us that are doing something that we love, that it doesn't, I mean, it's not, I mean, certainly, like, I would love to go to the Korean spa that I love and not be talking about financial aid there. That would be great. But generally speaking, I mean, even my kids, and now you're going to feel bad for them, but my kids are very engaged in my work life too. And I think that matters. They say really interesting things to me. I mean, they know a lot about the Pell Grant because we named the cat Pell. The dog is Bernie. So, you know, I think that there's some integration as well. In other words, one thing that I did that, the one reason I do that is because I want them to know why I'm working. I want them to know why I care. I always make sure they know what I'm doing when I'm not with them, because they need to know that I'm not with them because I don't love them. It's because I'm doing something about making the world a better place. And I always ask myself if I've done that justice. If I wasted my time, that's when I'm upset. And I'm trying to take back stuff, take back the time that I do think is wasted, recapture it.
I've got a great question here. Can you talk about the power of social media in connecting people of color across time, space, especially in this world of white academia? Now, that's a real question. And actually, I just experienced this before I came to this session. Melissa Harris Perry had a special lunch for a variety of faculty of color and allies around her center that is looking at justice for women and girls of color. And there were some people at my table that I knew from UT Austin and other spaces, but I met 5 people in that room that I only knew and was connected with on social media that are allies of mine. And I think this is an important question. I don't think I would be as connected as I am to Diane Ravitch without the power of social media. We first introduced each other, I think, when I sent you the Harvard Ed Review paper that I wrote about social studies and race in Texas, right? So can you talk about the democratization of knowledge? And then if you're able and interested, can you talk about the connection of people of color via social media?
Well, you know, my first impulse was to say, being white, I'm not the right person to talk about how people of color connect on social media, because generally speaking, when you first meet people on social media, you don't know who they are or what they look like. You don't know their race or you know their gender, usually because of their name, but not always. But I think that, you know, taking into account the fact that I have no expertise on the question, I think that what social media has done has been to create this enormous democratization of issues where people can connect with one another. I think, for example, of what happened recently in North Carolina, where they passed this legislation that said it was okay to discriminate against transgender people. And now this legislation is being broadened and sweeping through the South, through Mississippi, South Carolina, Georgia. The governor of Georgia vetoed it when he realized that the business community didn't like it. And hopefully the governor of South Carolina will veto it. But it was social media that really whipped the flames of this. And it became something that was not just about transgender, but a sense of this could happen to you. If you're Black, if you're Hispanic, if you're gay, if you're this, if you're that, if you're Catholic, if you're Jewish, it could happen to you. And so there was this tremendous outpouring, and I think that social media has nationalized these issues and brought together coalitions of people who would never know one another because they see themselves represented, even though, you know, even though you're not transgender, you know that that's discrimination and it's wrong. And someone from North Carolina sent me a YouTube video of a young woman who described her process, born a male with genitals, and always feeling that she was a girl, and she was very beautiful. She was about 13 years old, and she talked for 10 or 15 minutes, and then her mother talked, her sister talked, her father talked. Her father's a Presbyterian minister. And, you know, the audience was virtually in tears by the end of this 12-minute video, and how you could justify discriminating against this child. You know, it's the human empathy thing. And I think that YouTube was powerful there. Social media is powerful in disseminating it. And it does create this connection that makes us human.
In terms of the second part of the question about uniting scholars of color, I think we need to start from the position of how are scholars of color located throughout the academy. And that is that frequently it's an issue of solo status. You're out there by yourself. You're the one black scholar in this department. You're the one Chicano over here in this school. And so I think in many respects, because there is power in numbers, that social media has been a method of, you know, increasing these social networks and actually creating some sense of institutional protection in the, or at least institutional support, institutional protection for scholars of color. And in some respects, it's out of a matter of just scholarly survival, but also scholarly nourishment, because if you're the only one doing this work and you're a scholar of color, frequently you are the only one doing this work and you're a scholar of color, but by having this connection through social media, you can actually both let people know what you're doing, as well as have people send you what they're doing. And I think both of those are incredibly important, especially because, at least psychologically, for me as a non-tenured scholar of color, when I get one of those rare victories, when I actually get something published after being rejected 9 times, the people around me, yeah, they will celebrate. They'll say, hey, good job, pat on the back. I put that stuff out on Facebook, and, you know, my folks all throughout the country are like, this is awesome. Big props. My phone's blowing up from text, and it can create the sense of a larger academic community, and that's incredibly important psychologically in an environment of academia where we're usually set up to fail, and we can continually feel that we're less than and less than and less than, and we need to savor and celebrate all these little victories. Actually, there are no little victories. We need to celebrate every victory, and in many respects, social media becomes a platform for that, especially for minoritized folks.
So for you at home watching on the live stream or at work, and those of you here in the room, we only have 5 minutes left, and I want to end with one question for each of the panelists. That question is, considering the perils and the opportunities that we talked about today, should you engage in public scholarship, and why?
Well, I would say absolutely yes, because if you have spent a lot of time writing a book or writing an article, social media gives you the opportunity to reach many, many more people than you would through the traditional publication route. So yes, go the traditional publication route, because this is where you can do your serious work. But you can then write a shorter version and post it, or you can post the original version, and it will get through tweeting and Facebook, it will get out to tens of thousands of people. If you had been in this position 20 years ago, it would have been read by 1,500 people. So it makes a huge difference in terms of your ability to get your voice out there and to engage with other scholars.
I think it depends on what you're doing. I mean, I think there's certainly room in the academy for people who don't want to do this. I mean, you know, they're doing exploratory work. They're not quite sure, you know, it's not about policy, right? I mean, we have all kinds of research that's going on, some of which, you know, may take 20 or 30 years before you really have something that you feel like you really want to say to the public per se. And I think we have to value that, because some discoveries take a long time, you know, and there's a lot of different kinds of work. But if your goal, if the work you're doing is intended to inform, you know, practice or policy, and you want to reach people, I don't know how you can think you're doing it if you're not engaging in this way. I mean, you're really missing out. So, you know, I don't think, though, that, you know, a measure of success is every professor's on Twitter. You know, I think it's a lot, you know, I think that's oversimplified. But I certainly think that it can enrich your life and your life and your work. And I think those are one and the same.
I personally think that we're moving in a very strongly anti-intellectual move as a nation right now. There's a high level of skepticism about scholarship, a high level of skepticism about higher education as a whole. And I think that there is a massive call for us to engage the public. We can't afford to be in the ivory tower anymore. We need to actually be publicly engaged. And to the extent that the masses don't value our work, we have to make a strong case that our work matters. And that not all, and I hate to say this, but not all opinions are created equal in terms of being equally valid representations of the social world. And I think that we need to actually defend that place. And the place to defend that is not in peer-reviewed publications. And I don't want to sit here and say arrogantly that we know truth and the masses don't. But I think we've been absolutely derelict in our responsibilities in terms of saying that, yes, our work matters. There are, and I would actually say that this panel is more the exception as opposed to the rule, and that becomes sort of a calling to all of academia and scholarship to make our work relevant, not just to each other, but actually more broadly speaking.
I think I like Sarah's response that it depends. I think it depends on a couple of pretty significant things. One, it depends on whether scholars are at a point in their scholarship when they have something that is rigorous and reliable and credible and well thought through, and that adds to the discourse from their expertise. Two, if they want to just speak up because they have strong feelings about this law or that personality, they have the exact same right, to my mind, as anybody else in the country to make their voice heard. But I don't see that as public scholarship. I see that as wanting to say something. And so I think it's useful for people to draw that distinction between when they're operating as public scholars and when they're just operating as people with something to say. And the third thing, I guess I'd say, is I think it really depends how scholars go about doing it. One, there is, for many, there's an incentive, there's a comfort just hanging out in the ivory tower, trying to land grants, publish in the scholarly journals. It's a pretty nice life if you can get tenure in a place that you like to live. That's not what we're talking about. But the other extreme is this notion, which I think Nolan just did a nice job of contextualizing. There are folks who are like, I know the answer. I understand society and you don't. I understand what the evaluation results show and you don't. And it's important to understand that the world's actually a really big, complicated place. People have different value orientations and priors, especially from AERA. Lots of people in lots of states see these questions just through a very different prism. Doesn't make them bad people. I tend to agree more with them than with my friends at AERA. So I think it's important to have some empathy for that. There are people who have nice ideas, and in practice, the world works very differently than they'd like it to. So I think part of it is understanding that engaging as a public scholar does not mean going out there to tell the unwashed what they should think and what they should do, but to contribute one's knowledge and expertise is part of a big, complicated conversation. And I think when folks do that, and do it with some humility, that it makes an enormous contribution, and actually, I think there's a real appetite for it.
And that's a fantastic conclusion for us. Because we're talking about public scholarship, the conversation does not have to end here for you in the audience or for those watching at home. You can tweet at us. If you look at my Twitter feed, at Professor JVH, I have all of the Twitter handles of each of the folks up here. And because we're public scholars, tweet at us, and I suspect that most of us would be willing to respond back. So thank you so much for engaging in this conversation, and have a great afternoon.
That's right.